We are in Isaiah chapter 26 tonight. You can be turning there. And we're getting close to the end of this really long section on the oracles against the nations. Chapters 13 through 27 describe God's humbling of the proud nations and assume this principle throughout, that God, the God of Israel, is really the God of all the nations. We see, of course, this. We're in the third box on this slide here, the one where there's no headings because there's no specific nation being addressed. It's a series of judgments on the world city and God acting on behalf of His people. We've looked at chapters 24 and 25 last time, where God overthrows the world and Israel sings a song of praise in response to the overthrow. But now we're going to look at another song that Israel sings in chapter 26, a song of trust. And then in chapter 27, we're going to look at this oracle of salvation that God has, where He describes His actions on behalf of Israel. Let's pick up in chapter 26. Oh, I had this slide up here too, the contrast between the world city and God's city. The city of chaos, the fortified city, versus Mount Zion. Just kind of keep these references in mind as we go throughout. Chapter 26. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. He sets up walls and ramparts for security. Open the gates that the righteous nation may enter, the one that remains faithful. The steadfast of mind you will keep in perfect peace, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever. For in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. For He has brought low those who dwell on high, the unassailable city. He lays it low to the ground. He casts it to the dust. The foot will trample it, the feet of the afflicted, the steps of the helpless. The way of the righteous is smooth. O upright one, make the path of the righteous level. Indeed, while following the way of your judgments, O Lord, we have waited for you eagerly. Your name, even your memory, is the desire of our souls. At night my soul longs for you. Indeed, my spirit within me seeks you diligently. For when the earth experiences your judgments, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. Though the wicked is shown favor, he does not learn righteousness. He deals unjustly in the land of uprightness, and does not perceive the majesty of the Lord. O Lord, your hand is lifted up, yet they do not see it. They see your zeal for the people and are put to shame. Indeed, fire will devour your enemies. Lord, you will establish peace for us, since you have also performed for us all our works. O Lord our God, other masters besides you have ruled us, but through you alone we confess your name. The dead will not live. The departed spirits will not rise. Therefore you have punished and destroyed them, and you have wiped out all remembrance of them. You have increased the nation, O Lord. You have increased the nation. You are glorified. You have extended all the borders of the land. O Lord, they sought you in distress. They could only whisper a prayer. Your chastening was upon them. As the pregnant woman approaches the time to give birth, she writhes and cries out in her labor pains. Thus were we before you, O Lord. We were pregnant, we writhed in labor. We gave birth, as it seems, only to wind. We could not accomplish deliverance for the earth, nor were inhabitants of the world born. Your dead will live. Their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust, awake and shout for joy, for your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits. Come, my people, enter into your rooms, and close your doors behind you. Hide for a little while, until indignation runs its course. For behold, the Lord is about to come out of His place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. And the earth will reveal her bloodshed, and will no longer cover her slain. In that day the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. And as you probably guessed, I don't like the chapter division here. Verse 27, verse 1 is kind of one of those verses that people argue back and forth whether it goes with what comes before or what comes after. In many ways, it kind of links the two together. We're going to see that as we go through. But what would you say is the purpose of this song here? How hard it's been, okay. All right. But what else? What's the purpose? Why is this written?
Well, ultimately, he's indicating here that no matter how hard everything got, God was always in charge, and that God took care of them. God took care of His people, and God is going to always take care of His people if we will continue to trust in Him, no matter how hard life may get.
Right, right. When are they going to sing this? When things are bad? What does it say? 26, verse 1.
Well, when they have set up the walls and ramparts for security and so forth, when they're secure, they need to be singing this song.
It says in verse 1, in that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. But what day are we talking about?
Well, we have a strong city. He sets up walls and ramparts for security.
Okay, when was that?
Would have been at the time of the return to Jerusalem, perhaps. One time when Cyrus decreed that they would return.
Possibly.
And they rebuilt the walls and
so they built
and all of
very
but they overcame them.
Very literal understanding of, we're going to have a strong city built for ourselves. And Jerusalem rebuilds its walls, and there's a great time of restoration to God and trust in God. So they might have sung this song in that day. Is that the only day that could be applicable here? Ooh, the day of salvation. Like Paul says, today is the day of salvation, 2 Corinthians 6. Well, what would be the city if that were the case? It's a spiritual city.
Spiritual Jerusalem.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Down out of heaven is in Revelation.
Okay.
Another application of this, I think, would be when Christ entered the world and fulfilled the plan of God to save mankind from his sin. He ushered in a glorious city that did not have walls and did not have boundaries, and it fills the earth, and that would be the church.
Right. Well, there's definitely, this is the difference between when we've been talking a lot about the cities that man builds, Babylon onward, the city of Enoch that Cain built, and every time man builds a city, what characteristics does man's city have? Well, it has walls, it's well protected, it's well fortified, all that. But ultimately, it's capable of being destroyed by armies. God says, no, you're doing it wrong. Let me show you how to build a city. When God builds a city, He builds something quite different. Instead of the walls and ramparts being made out of stone and brick and mortar, what are they made out of? Well, they're security and salvation, if you will. There's this idea that the walls and the ramparts are set up for security. The prophet Zechariah mentions this a little bit, where God Himself is a wall of fire around Jerusalem in Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 5. Isaiah also brings this up in Isaiah chapter 60 in verses 18 and 19. It says that violence will not be heard again in your land, nor devastation or destruction within your borders, but you will call your walls salvation and your gates praise. No longer will you have the sun for light by day, nor for brightness will the moon give you light, but you will have the Lord for an everlasting light and your God for your glory. There's this idea that God Himself is going to be the city's protection. A city without walls would be considered vulnerable, naked, easily attackable. But the city of God doesn't have physical walls, but yet it's completely unassailable according to this because, God is there.
Verse 2 indicates that when he says, open the gates that the righteous nation may enter.
Mm-hmm.
This is a city that has walls of protection, but the gates are open that the righteous may enter.
Right. Actually, who's quoting who? Well, it depends on who you think wrote Psalm 118, but in Psalm 118 in verses 19 through 20, you have that same idea. Open to me the gates of righteousness. I shall enter through them. I shall give thanks to the Lord. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous will enter through it. I shall give thanks to you, for you have answered me, and you have become my salvation. So there's this picture, if you will, of this, the gates of the city are open so that the righteous people can enter. Part of that psalm was later applied to Jesus' actual triumphal entrance into Jerusalem. And there's other psalms that ask the question or contemplate on the question, who can enter God's sanctuary or holy place? Actually, where Seth preaches at Clearwater, they were just talking about Psalm 15 last night. And there's the idea right there, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill? Well, the righteous person, the person with clean hands and a pure heart.
You were talking about having a wall of fire in the hymn that we sometimes sing, Lily of the Valley. It says, He will never, never leave me, nor yet forsake me here, while I live by faith and do His blessed will. A wall of fire about me, I have nothing now to fear. When I first read that, I'm thinking, I've got a wall of fire around me, that's what I would be afraid of, but God's actually going to protect me from the wall of fire. But that's not the sentiment of when we see a wall of fire at all in the Old Testament. The wall of fire around us is the protection. That nothing can come through that wall of fire. The wall of fire is the protection by God.
It's always interesting when you're singing, when you're reading through the Bible and you see phrases that have appeared in hymns that it's like, wait, that's from the Bible? I just saw the expression everlasting arms the other day in Deuteronomy 33, and I realized that is a scriptural song, actually. But no, Zechariah chapter 2 is the passage that talks about this. In Zechariah 2, it says that I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man with a measuring line in his hand. So I said, where are you going? And he said to me, to measure Jerusalem and see how wide it is and how long it is. Behold, the angel was speaking with me, was going out. Another angel was coming out to meet him and said to him, run, speak to that young man, saying, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls because of the multitude of men and cattle within it. For I, declares the Lord, will be a wall of fire around her, and I will be the glory in her midst. Zechariah 2, verses 1 through 5. This is a sense in which God Himself is the first line of defense for the city. Only the righteous may enter. Verse 3, the steadfast of mind you will keep in, literally, peace. My version says perfect peace. It's kind of interesting. Peace, peace actually becomes a slogan later on in the days of Jeremiah, if you'll remember. They're saying peace, peace, because we've got the city of God around us that's going to protect us. But of course they had that idea all wrong. Because the city of God wasn't the physical city of Jerusalem, because that city actually fell. They were saying peace, peace, and there was no peace. They were pretending to be righteous, but they weren't righteous, and so they had no right to be in the city of God, or to call themselves the city of God even. But what is it that makes a person righteous, according to this song?
Trust in the Lord forever.
Trust in the Lord forever. There's another way of saying that in Habakkuk 2 and verse 4. The righteous one shall live by trust. Abraham trusted God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6, etc. It's kind of an idea that you see throughout the New Testament being elaborated on. It's this idea that we are declared righteous before God on the basis of our trust in Him. Habakkuk 2 isn't the only passage that teaches that. Isaiah 26 also teaches that. And trust is interesting how trust is both the cause and the result of salvation in this instance. On the one hand, these people who trust God, therefore God's going to save them. But on the other hand, the fact that God saves them gives them a basis for trusting Him still further. So it's kind of this never-ending cyclical thing that takes place. We have a similar idea in Isaiah chapter 12. You will say on that day, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for though you were angry with me, your anger was turned away, and you comfort me. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. For the Lord God is my strength and my song, and He has become my salvation. And so there's this idea here that this Isaiah says, I'm going to trust God because He has saved me. Here we see that God saves the person who trusts in Him. Well, which is it? Well, it's not an either or, it's a both and. Now, is that trust in God? Is that just kind of a one-time event, where I thought this special thought or said this special prayer or whatnot and believed one time and that's it? Is that what it is? What's the text say? Trust in the Lord forever, verse 4. And the reason we trust in the Lord forever is because we have an everlasting trust in the everlasting rock is what we're called on to have here. Trust is not a one-time event in one's life. It is a way of one's life. Seth?
My favorite proverb, for the moment anyway, is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord always, with all your heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him and He will make your path straight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another good passage to bring up about that. God is called the everlasting rock here. That's actually a pretty common Old Testament description of God. Deuteronomy 32, the rock, His work is perfect. Some of the Psalms describe Him as a rock. Isaiah has used that description before, and he'll use it again later. Isaiah 8:14, for instance, that He will become a sanctuary, but to the houses of Israel a stone to strike, and a rock to stumble over, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In 28:16, God says, I am laying in Zion a stone, a tested stone, a costly cornerstone for the foundation firmly placed. He who believes in it will not be disturbed. Isaiah 30 in verse 29, you have songs of the night when you keep the festival and gladness of heart, as when one marches to the sound of the flute to go to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. And there's a couple of other passages we could probably go to think about that. And by contrast to all that, and trusting in God in this strong city, in verses 5 and 6, we have the world city. The unassailable city. Nobody can challenge them. But it says in verse 5 what? He has brought them down. He has brought them low. He lays them into the dust and is going to be trampled. The helpless people, even the trampled by the afflicted, which is kind of interesting. The people who were helpless, the people who would not have been considered successful in this world, they're the ones who are going to have victory ultimately. The helpless triumph over those who helped themselves, we might say. So it really echoes the humbling of proud Babylon that we've seen elsewhere in the Scriptures. And really just kind of echoes this principle once again that whoever exalts himself will be humbled. And whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Any questions up through verse 6 or comments or any other ideas? Alright, verses 7 through 15 are kind of this lengthy contrast between the righteous and the wicked. And what would we say about the righteous and the wicked? What's the difference between the two? Kind of drawing on the language of Psalm 1 here. And Proverbs 3, obviously. Well, probably drawing on a lot of different passages, but
the way of the righteous is smooth, just like trust in the Lord always.
Mm-hmm.
He will make the path straight.
Right. Well, why would the way of the righteous be smooth? I mean, normally we got to appreciate the ancient world. They didn't have this complex interstate system running through Israel or anything like that. But
well, as Hebrews says, for us anyway, we have a trailblazer. If you've ever tried to walk through like the mangroves that are around here, that's all twisted and all kinds of gnarly, and you're trying to make your way through it and try to direct your own path through that, you're not going to be able to go very quickly. If someone comes before you and cuts out a clear path and is that trailblazer, someone that you can follow in their path, it's significantly easier. When your path is laid out for you, it's a lot easier to walk than when you have to trying to make your own way in the world.
Does Isaiah ever mention like trailblazers or anything like that, or? He mentions a bunch of times, but one passage in particular that comes to mind is in chapter 40, in verses 3 through 5. A voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Let every valley be lifted up, let every mountain and hill be made low. Let the rough ground become a plain and the rugged terrain a broad valley. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. There's this idea that God There's other passages in Isaiah that talk about this idea of God building a highway, a straight way that man will be able to go down. Sometimes the highway is depicted as connecting the nations to Israel. Like Egypt and Assyria would have a highway built to the city of God, and they would come down that highway and they would worship God. But there's other passages that talk about this, and Isaiah 40 is probably the most famous one because, well, it's quoted in the New Testament. John the Baptist is explicitly cited as the guy who prepares the way for Jesus. Well, who's more righteous than Jesus? But just as John prepares the way for Jesus and creates a smooth highway for Him to come into the world, Jesus Himself is also preparing the way for us. Is He not? He goes to prepare a place for us. That's what He says to His disciples in John 14. He sends the Spirit so that we might have some help in walking that path. And you have this idea here. The righteous are the ones who walk on this, that God makes this path and the righteous walk on it. Verse 8, we have this idea of longing for God or waiting for God. While following the way of your judgments, O Lord, we have waited for you eagerly. Your name, even your memory, is the desire of our souls. What makes somebody righteous isn't just, I kept all these different rituals, I did all these different steps or whatnot. It's the fact that they trusted God. They longed for Him. He is the longing of their souls. He says at night, verse 9, my soul longs for you. The translation obscures this a little bit, but the word for desire in verse 8 and the word for longs in verse 9 are actually the same word. Your memory is the longing of our souls. At night my soul longs for you. Indeed, my spirit within me seeks you diligently, or possibly early, which would offer a nice contrast with night. For when the earth experiences your judgments, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. Well, how did they learn righteousness through what? What's that say? Judgments. The judgments of God are going to teach us righteousness. That God's judgment on the world is going to teach us something about Him. But yeah. Now, by contrast, verse 10, though the wicked is shown favor, he does not learn righteousness. So the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness because of God's judgments, but when the wicked are shown favor, they don't learn righteousness. And He deals unjustly in the land of uprightness and does not perceive the majesty of the Lord. Let me ask you something. How are the wicked shown favor? What's that?
We live in a very, very prosperous nation, but it's also a very, very ungodly one.
Yeah, okay. Mark.
Through the patience of God, people have the opportunity to reject Him.
All right.
We might look to Solomon the king as an example of this. When Solomon began, God told him, I'll grant you anything that you ask me for. And he said, I would like wisdom to lead. I'm like a child. I don't know how to lead the people in or take the people out. He said, and here I am now king over all these people. I would like you to give me wisdom. God said, because you have asked for the better thing, I'm going to give you the riches, I'm going to give you the honor, and all of the other things you could have asked for. And the problem with that was that even though Solomon had the greatest wisdom ever, that God ever allowed a human being to have, all of these other things ruined him. And he went off and he started marrying these foreign women and building gods to them in Jerusalem, and then he started worshiping with them, and he went astray. And here it was at the time of Solomon, gold was so common in Israel that silver was like the stones on the ground. If you went to the baker to buy a loaf of bread and took silver in your hand, the baker would say, throw that stuff out, that's worthless. I want gold. That's how wealthy they were. And we about approach that in this land today, but nonetheless, that was the beginning of Israel's downfall, when they really hit the mountaintop of glory, so to speak, the way man looks at it.
I think it goes a little bit beyond that. I mean, we're definitely reading this in light of, well, the wicked are shown favor. Is it just the rich wicked people that are shown favor?
No.
Okay, all right. Well, how else is every other wicked shown favor? Yeah, God causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. Matthew 5, 44 and 45. God's impartial in some sense. Whenever
like the farmer that wrote into the newspaper and said, I planted my crop on Sunday and I plowed the earth on Sunday, I planted on Sunday, I watered on Sunday, I fertilized, I did all the work on Sunday, and I had the best crop yield in the entire county. And the editor of the paper wrote back and said, final judgment does not come on Sunday.
Well, there's a 1 in 7 shot, I guess.
Yeah, it just, but that, his point was that, okay, you got some material blessings. The guy was really proud of himself for all that he had done, and proving that there was no God, because here he was, an atheist who was being blessed.
Well, it doesn't prove anything. Seth, you had something?
I forgot.
You forgot? Oh, okay.
Sorry.
All right, well, another passage that you might go to is in Acts 4, verses 16 and 17, where Paul and Barnabas are at Lystra, and, one of the comments they make when they heal the guy, and the people of Lystra want to make them out to be gods and make sacrifices to them. And Paul says, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go to their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." So in other words, God's been blessing you even though you didn't know it, is the point. Paul says, you may not realize it, but God, has given witness to himself. Where do you think all that food you ate came from? Where do you think that air you're breathing comes from? Well, that's a gift of God. Life itself is a gift of God. And once we lose sight of that fact and we put ourselves in the place of God, we ignore the fact that he has just as much right to take life away as he does to give it. Mark.
Could this particular statement, taken in the light of verse 11, this is a song that's going to be sung by the righteous. And sometimes the righteous will look at the wicked and go, man, they're having so much fun out there. They're doing things that I wish I could do, and this kind of, and you get that kind of longing, and of course that's the way the devil tempts us. And couldn't this be perhaps God's way of saying, look, even though the wicked is shown favor, and even though the wicked are having some good times right now, remember, that's all they're going to get. Oh Lord, your hand is lifted up, yet they do not see it. Mm-hmm. The destruction is about to come on the wicked, but the wicked are having such a good time, they don't see it.
Yeah.
Don't long for that, what they have.
Right. Well, there's kind of an emphasis here on perception problems that the wicked have. They don't learn righteousness. They don't perceive majesty. They don't see God's hand. Although it says they see your zeal for the people and are put to shame. That statement could also be, let them see your zeal for the people and let them be put to shame. And subsequently let the fire devour your enemies, which would make verse 11 more of a call for God to actually act instead of describing an action that's already taken place. Now, contrast that, also verse 14. Because the wicked have no perception, what happens? They have no memory either. You have wiped out all remembrance of them, at the end of verse 14. By contrast, you have the righteous. They have a smooth path. They're waiting for God. They're desiring His memory. They're learning righteousness. There's peace for us. There's confession in verse 13. It says that, O Lord our God, our other masters besides you have ruled us, but through you we confess your name. And therefore in verse 15 there's the glorification of the nation. So verses 14 and 15 kind of contrast the collective fates. On the one hand, the dead will not live. The departed spirits will not rise. No resurrection for you. All of your memory is gone. There's a hopelessness of death. Very similar to what Hosea says in Hosea 13 verse 14. Where in Hosea 13 and verse 14, God asks this hypothetical question, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your thorns? O death, Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion will be hidden from my sight. And the point in the context of Hosea is, God's not going to raise them from the dead, which, Paul takes it and kind of turns it on its head in 1 Corinthians 15 where he quotes it. But here, what happens? The dead will not live, Isaiah 26:14. Death is the end for you. There's hopelessness. But verse 15 talks about a promise. You have increased the nation. You've glorified the land, extended the borders of the land. It's kind of an interesting idea right there. On the one hand, you've got Joshua who gave the people the land in Joshua 22, gave them rest on every side, and yet you have future promises of a land after the fact. Well, to use the language of the Hebrew author, if Joshua had given them the land, then there would be no need to speak of a further land after that. But there remains a promised land for the people of God. Now, there's another comment, a couple of other questions that could come up here. Why would foreigners rule? Who are the other masters ruling over Israel? I guess I just answered the question. The other masters besides you have ruled us. But what can we say about that? Does that discredit God's claim of lordship over His people?
The one that sent them other people to rule over.
Yeah, okay. It's kind of similar to, 60... This is kind of a lament in some ways. It's like, God, why is it like this? Why? All of these other people are ruling over us. There's a similar statement in 63:19. We have become like those over whom you have never ruled.
I wonder, though, if this might not be a reference to the idols that they went after. Other masters besides you have ruled us, but through you alone we confess your name.
Possibly.
That here people have run off on these other masters, but you're really the only true master, and it's only through you that we can come to the truth and confess your name.
There might be something to that. There's kind of this. I don't know if it's idols or if it's warring leaders. But at the end of the day, once all of this has happened, there's a fate for the wicked and there's a fate for the righteous. The wicked have destruction and death, and the righteous have a promise, an increase and glorification. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Any comments or questions up through verse 15? All right, verse 16. Verses 16 through 19 describe this lament. And it says that they sought you in distress. They could only whisper a prayer. Your chastening was upon them. Who's doing the chastening here? Who's inflicting the suffering here? Does God cause suffering? What? Some people think that God doesn't cause suffering. But one of the key biblical affirmations in the Bible is that no, God does cause suffering on people. He does inflict it. And it's ultimately deserved. It's the state of the human race. You'll note that there's kind of a word play going on here. They sought you is the same word as punish in verse 14. You have punished and destroyed them, pakad. Lord, they have sought you, pakad and destroyed. It's a pretty wide semantic range for word, but there's a nice little word play going on there. Now the word has a pretty wide range of meaning. It's the same word used in 27:1 to say that God's going to punish Leviathan. The labor of a pregnant woman in verses 17 and 18 is used as an interesting symbol of judgment and distress. Now normally, whenever a woman is giving birth to a child and she's in labor, what usually happens at the end of that? There's a baby there.
Big time joy.
Yeah, joy, right? It's like Jesus says in John 16:21, when a woman is in labor, she has pain. When the child is born, she has joy and she forgets her former pain. What's wrong with this pregnancy here in verses 17 and 18?
Well, he doesn't put it this way here, but it might be likened to a woman who goes through all of the labor and everything, and her child is born dead.
Yeah. Well, in this case, it says she's giving birth to wind, which
to nothing.
It's like, what? And that's kind of a shocker for you. They're incapable of completing the delivery. Human efforts fall short. We need some kind of divine intervention needed. Seth, that look on your face tells me you're thinking something. Is it something that can't go on the recording? Okay. Be on the internet forever. All right, well, finally, verse 19, your dead will live, their corpses will rise. Well, right away, alarm bells should be going off. Wait a second. We just read the opposite of that in verse 14, didn't we? So what's the point? What is this teaching us about resurrection? Verse 14 says the dead will not live, and verse 19 says the dead will live.
This is one of the obvious inconsistencies of the Bible.
Clearly the evidence of...
It's false.
No, it's just clearly evidence of a bunch of different sources that have been redacted together by a clumsy editor, right?
Right.
No. No, that answer is incorrect. Anybody got a better one?
It's one side.
Huh?
Acts. One side.
Once God decides... Well, I mean, and we've been emphasizing throughout, that God is the taker of life, but He's also the giver of life. The fact that God gives life gives Him the right to take it in the first place. But He can give it back again. It's like Jesus says, I lay down my life and I can take it up again if I want to, in John 10. So, I mean, and it is an elaboration of what we read last week in 25 verse 8, that He will swallow up death for all time. Now, the only way that God's promises, that God's hope can mean anything is if there is a resurrection of the dead. When God says, the wicked are going to die, but the righteous are going to have their land expanded. You're looking around and go, well, I know lots of righteous people that are, dead. The only way that God's promise can mean anything at all is if there is a resurrection of the dead. Otherwise, it's all for naught. Now, there's lots of passages that talk about corpses coming out of the grave, and, Ezekiel 37 describes the valley of dry bones, Daniel 12, John 5, Jesus talks about a spiritual resurrection that's kind of in an already not yet state. But then He says, there's an hour coming when all who are in the tombs will hear His voice, and they will all come forth, some to a resurrection of life, some to a resurrection of judgment. And, on the one hand, it says, you who lie in the dust. Well, dust was the destination of the world city. It was trampled into the dust of the ground. But here He says, you who lie in the dust, your corpses will rise. You're going to come out of the dust. You're going to awake and shout for joy. The earth gives birth to the departed spirits. You got to love that. After all that imagery of a woman writhing in labor, failing to bring forth the delivery, you see that the earth itself now gives birth to the departed spirits, to those who had long passed away and died, and they come forth in this resurrection here. So that's the hope that's described, that's implicit in this song of Isaiah. It's the only resolution to the tension between God's promises for the future and the sufferings that we're currently undergoing in the present. Any comments or questions up through verse 19? Verse 20. All right, now we have this statement here which kind of respond to the lament. I almost said lament. The people are told to enter their rooms. Why would they be told to do that?
Well, there's safety.
Go to your room.
A measure of safety in the rooms.
Okay, right. So it's a place of refuge. It's not like God's sending them to their room like a kid that's done something bad. Well, no, He's telling them hide for a while until indignation passes over, which same word that's used about the Exodus and God passing over and all that. In verse 20, and then it says in verse 21 that the Lord is coming out, and here's the indignation. He's going to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity, and the earth will reveal her bloodshed and will no longer cover her slain. There's a great punishment that God is going to bring about on all the inhabitants of the earth. We had a similar statement back in chapter 24 in verse 21 and 22, that God will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth on the earth. Here it says that God's going to punish the inhabitants of the earth in verse 21, and then in verse 1 of chapter 27, it says that God will also punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword. And that parallelism between punish is kind of why I would lean more towards grouping it with what comes before than what comes after. Well, that raises an interesting question, though. What's Leviathan? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Many guesses.
Huh?
There have been many guesses.
Let's hear some of those guesses.
Well, in a comic book that I read, it was a big whale.
Okay, it was a big whale. It was actually a big whale in Moby Dick, too. What else?
A gigantic Nile crocodile.
Gigantic Nile crocodile, that's what some people think it is in Job, at least.
Leviathan is
I don't buy that, but...
a word that conjures up images of some kind of a big monster.
Yes.
Like a dinosaur, or T-Rex, or, in Jurassic Park, or something of that nature. What it was, like you say, there's as many guesses as there are scholars who guess.
Seth?
I've also heard it's hippopotamus.
Oh.
Very, very dangerous.
Well, first of all, Leviathan was a sea monster that existed in pagan literature around that time, actually before that time. In fact, there's a lot of creation myths in the pagan writings that there was a sea monster named Leviathan that's slain by Baal or Marduk or whoever happens to be there at that time. Before the gods could create the world, they had to kill the vicious monster from which they could make the rest of the universe. Now, the Bible kind of cites that image and pokes fun at it a little bit in places. For instance, in some passages, Yahweh is the one who's shown as slaying Leviathan. Psalm 74:14, Job 41 is this long discourse about God defeating this great beast that Job can't do anything about. But in other passages, we see that Yahweh doesn't defeat Leviathan, He creates it. For instance, Genesis 1:21 mentions that when God creates the fish of the sea, He also creates the sea monsters. Well, what were those? Whales or whatnot? Well, it's a jab at that idea of pagan thinking. You think your God's so special because He slew the great sea monster. He says, well, our God actually created the sea monster in the first place. Psalm 104:26 is another one that does this. Now, here in Isaiah, Leviathan is an obvious figure for what?
Something that opposes God.
Something that opposes God. Like the enemy nations. If you were to draw a picture of it, it would look like a giant dragon. Which, you actually see that image adapted in the book of Revelation a little bit. It's not called Leviathan there, but in Revelation chapter 12, who is the one that stirs up all the wicked nations in the first place to oppress God's people? Well, it's the dragon, Satan, the serpent of old. Here, Leviathan's called the fleeing serpent. This is kind of, we're not studying Job, but I do suspect that Leviathan is probably a figure for Satan in the book of Job, but that's another discussion for later. The point of this comment is to demonstrate God's supremacy. God defeats all enemies, both the nations themselves and the great dragon behind them, if you will, that gives them their power in the first place. So really what we're looking at is kind of God's judgment is very total. It doesn't just deal with the symptoms, it deals with the actual problem, the beast that has been driving this whole thing. Now, the expression "in that day" also connects this verse to what follows in chapter 27, but we are past time, so we're going to have to stop now. Are there any questions or comments on this point, or thoughts? Well, if not, then we will pick up again with chapter 27, and we will hopefully finish this section on the two cities. That'll be all for now.